The day Lavinia Finley rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, the whole dusty town seemed to hold its breath, as if the prairie wind itself had paused to take notice of the woman who would change everything about the quiet, broken man who sat whittling on the porch of the livery stable at the end of Main Street. Lavinia had traveled 3 days from Wichita, her trunk strapped to the back of the stage, her back straight as a fence post despite the rattling of the coach over hard, rutted earth. She was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat, green eyes that caught the October light like river glass, and a jaw set with the particular kind of determination that came not from arrogance but from necessity. She had been summoned to Caldwell to take over her late uncle's mercantile after a fever had taken him in early September. She had no husband, no father to consult, and no patience for people who assumed that either of those things should trouble her. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of Holt's Dry Goods and Tavern, and Lavinia stepped down before the driver could offer his hand, which made him blink in surprise. She looked up at the sun, then down the length of Main Street, cataloging the town the way a sensible woman catalogs a new situation, noting what was there, what was missing, and what needed work. That was when she first saw him. He was sitting on an upturned barrel in front of the livery, a folding knife in one hand and a piece of pine in the other. He was lean, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and 3 days' worth of beard along a jaw that might have been handsome under better circumstances. His shirt was clean but worn at the elbows, his boots resoled more than once. He was not whittling anything in particular. She realized after a moment he was just passing the knife over the wood the way some men drank, simply to occupy the hands and quiet the head. He did not look at her. Almost every other person on the street did. The blacksmith stopped hammering. 2 women on the opposite boardwalk leaned their heads together. A boy of about 12 abandoned a hoop he had been rolling and stood with his mouth slightly open. But the man at the livery kept his eyes on the wood, and the wood only, as though the arrival of a new woman in Caldwell, Kansas, was the least interesting thing that had ever happened in his vicinity. Lavinia found that both irritating and intriguing. "Excuse me," she called across the street, because the livery was right next to the mercantile and she would need her trunk unloaded. "Could you direct me to someone who might assist with luggage?" The man glanced up then. His eyes were the color of weathered wood, not brown, not gray, but somewhere between the two, like the bark of a cottonwood in winter. He looked at her for a moment without expression, then jerked his chin toward the tavern. "Holt keeps a boy on." "I see," she said. "Thank you." He looked back down at his wood. That was the first time Lavinia Finley spoke to Andrew Ashford, and she thought very little of it, because she had a mercantile to inventory and a life to build, and she had not come to Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878 to think about a lean, quiet man with cottonwood eyes who could not be bothered to look up when a woman spoke to him. But she thought of it again that night, lying on the narrow cot in the back room of the mercantile, with the wind pushing against the shutters and the smell of dried goods and old timber all around her. She thought about the fact that he had answered without being dismissive, without being overly familiar, and without the particular kind of oily interest that some men showed a woman traveling alone. He had simply answered and gone back to what he was doing, as though he were perfectly content to sit there all evening with a piece of pine and a pocket knife, bothering nobody. She did not learn his name until the next morning. Reverend Dawes, who came to introduce himself while she was sweeping the front steps of the mercantile, was the one who told her. He was a small, white-haired man with a kind face and the habit of clasping his hands in front of him when he spoke, as though he were permanently about to offer a prayer. "You will find the town folk are mostly welcoming," he said. "The Hendersons run the hotel. The Mercers have the best horses if you need to hire a mount. Mrs. Calloway bakes on Tuesdays and sells loaves from her porch, and I recommend you get there before 8 because they go fast." He paused and glanced down the street toward the livery. The fellow at the stable is Andrew Ashford. He came through about a year ago and never left. He is capable enough, keeps to himself, does not cause trouble." But Reverend Dawes hesitated in the way of a man choosing words carefully. He has had a hard time of it. Lost his wife and his little girl to cholera in Nebraska about 3 years back now. He carries it still, and I expect he will carry it for some time to come. Lavinia looked down the street. Andrew Ashford was not on the barrel this morning. The livery doors were open, and she could hear the sound of someone moving inside, the shifting of horses and the clank of a bucket. "Thank you, Reverend," she said, and went back to sweeping. But she thought about what he had said all through the morning as she catalogued what remained of her uncle's inventory: sacks of flour and cornmeal, bolts of calico and muslin, coils of rope, tins of lard and molasses, boxes of percussion caps, a glass case of hard candy that the town's children would no doubt be interested in. She thought about grief the way she had learned to think about it herself, which was practically and with both hands, the way you handled something heavy. You acknowledged the weight of it, you shifted your grip, you kept moving. She had lost her mother at 17 and her father at 21. She was no stranger to the particular loneliness of continuing to exist in the absence of people who had defined your world. By the end of the first week, Lavinia had reorganized the mercantile entirely, had introduced herself to nearly every family in town, had hired a local girl named Bess Totham to help behind the counter on busy afternoons, and had nodded to Andrew Ashford 4 times as they passed on the street. Each time, he nodded back. Each time, he did not linger. It was Bess who provided further information without being asked. "Mr. Ashford," she said one afternoon, following Lavinia's gaze out the window to where Andrew was leading a bay mare down the street by her bridle. "He is the best horseman in 3 counties from what I hear. Broke a stallion nobody else would go near last spring. Does decent blacksmith work too when Garvey is overwhelmed." She paused and picked at a loose thread on her apron. "He does not come to church, he does not come to the dances, and he has turned down every invitation to supper that anyone has extended him. Mrs. Henderson tried 3 times. She shook her head. He is polite about it, just says he is not worth the trouble." Lavinia looked at Bess. "He says that. That is his exact phrase, apparently, not worth the trouble." Bess said it with a small, sad shake of her head. "He means well by it, I think. Like he is doing people a favor by keeping away." Lavinia turned that over in her mind the way you turn a stone over in a river, looking at the underside of it. A man who called himself not worth the trouble was not a man who did not care about people. He was a man who cared so much that he had decided the most merciful thing he could do was absent himself. There was a terrible, backward sort of love in that, and a terrible loneliness. She set down the bolt of blue calico she had been folding and straightened her apron. "Well," she said, more to herself than to Bess, "that is not for him to decide on behalf of everyone else, is it?" The opportunity came 2 weeks into October, on a Wednesday morning when a cold front had pushed down from the north, and the sky was the color of pewter. Lavinia was outside the mercantile arranging a small display of wool blankets on the porch railing. The cold weather had arrived early this year, and she intended to be ready for it, when she heard the sharp sound of a horse in distress from inside the livery. She listened for a moment. The sounds grew more agitated. Then she heard a man's voice, low and steady, not frightened but clearly working hard. She set down the blanket in her hands, walked across the street and pushed open the livery door. Andrew Ashford was inside with a young chestnut horse that was in a bad way, one of its front legs caught at an odd angle in a collapsed section of the floor where a board had given way, the animal trembling and rolling its eyes white. Andrew had the horse by the bridle with both hands and was speaking to it in a low, measured voice, keeping it still so it would not break the leg it had already strained. "Is there anything I can do?" Lavinia asked from the doorway. He glanced at her briefly. The look was not unwelcoming, simply assessing. "Hold the bridle," he said. "Keep talking to her. Don't let her panic. I need both hands to clear the board." Lavinia stepped in without hesitation, moved to the horse's head, took the bridle in both hands and began speaking to the animal in a calm, quiet voice. She had grown up near horses. She was not afraid. She kept her voice even and her hands steady, and she looked the horse in the eye, and she talked to it about the mercantile and the wool blankets on the porch, and the way the light had come in peculiar and golden that morning before the clouds moved in, and slowly, the horse's breathing began to even out. Andrew worked methodically at the broken board, clearing enough space to free the leg without the horse having to strain against the trap. When the leg came free, he guided the animal back a step and ran his hands down the leg, feeling for damage. "How bad?" Lavinia asked. "Sprained," he said. "Not broken. She will be all right in a week." He straightened and looked at Lavinia with the same direct, assessing quality she had noticed the first time he'd looked at her. "You handled her well." "I grew up with horses," she said simply, and let go of the bridle. There was a moment where neither of them spoke. The horse shifted, nudging at Lavinia's shoulder with her nose, and Lavinia lifted her hand automatically to stroke the animal's face. "I appreciate the help," Andrew said finally. He was not being cold. He was being careful in the way that people are careful when they are not sure what to do with kindness. "It was no trouble," Lavinia said. Something flickered in his expression just briefly, there and gone like heat lightning on a summer evening. "You should get back to your store," he said, "before the cold gets into those blankets." It was a dismissal, but it was a gentle one, and it contained within it the information that he had noticed her, that he had observed the blankets on the porch railing, that he was not as unaware of her as he had been performing. Lavinia recognized all of this and found it more interesting than she had expected. "I expect I should," she agreed, and walked back to the mercantile in the pewter-colored morning, and she was smiling slightly by the time she got to the porch. The winter settled in hard over Caldwell. By November the town was a study in brown and gray, the cottonwoods along the creek stripped bare, the wind cutting down from the northern plains with the kind of meanness that made you grateful for walls and fire. Lavinia kept the mercantile warm and busy, had established herself as a fair-dealing, no-nonsense proprietor who did not inflate prices and did not tolerate rudeness in either direction across her counter, and had become, somewhat to her own surprise, genuinely fond of the town. She saw Andrew most days. Caldwell was not a large place. He would come into the mercantile for supplies: flour, coffee, salt pork, tobacco for the older cowboys who left their horses in his care. He was always brief and always paid exact. He never lingered. He had a habit of placing his coins on the counter rather than directly in her hand, which she recognized after a while as a kind of consideration. He was minimizing contact, keeping a careful distance, the way a man does when he is afraid of what closeness might cost him. But he always looked at her when he spoke. He had the kind of directness in the eyes that is the opposite of rudeness. It is a form of respect, the willingness to be fully present with a person even if only for a moment. She began engineering small reasons to talk to him longer. She would ask his opinion on rope quality, knowing he would have a considered answer. She would mention a horse she had seen limping on the street and watch his face change, the reserve dropping away for a moment as concern for the animal replaced it. She would ask whether he thought the next snowfall would be deep enough to affect road access to the farms to the west. He always answered. He always tried to leave after the answer. She always had another question. By the third week of November, she noticed that he had stopped looking quite as surprised when she asked. He began arriving at the mercantile knowing there would be conversation, and though he never initiated it, there was something different in the set of his shoulders when he came through the door, slightly less braced, as though he had stopped preparing for something uncomfortable and was now simply preparing. It was Reverend Dawes who pushed things along, as small-town ministers often will. He had organized a communal dinner at the church for the last Saturday of November, which was a tradition the town had maintained for years. Everyone brought something. Tables were set up in the churchyard, and when the weather permitted, as it barely did that year, The whole of Caldwell's population gathered to eat together before the deep cold of December arrived in earnest. Lavinia brought dried apple pie and biscuits. The Calloway family brought a whole roasted side of pork. The Mercer women brought 3 types of pickled vegetables and a cornbread that Lavinia made a mental note to ask the recipe for. Andrew did not appear to intend to come. As 8 o'clock arrived and people began filling the churchyard, Lavinia noticed his absence. She noticed because she had begun, without quite deciding to, keeping a casual awareness of where he was in her daily life. When the livery doors opened, when the lamp went on in the room above the stable that he apparently used for sleeping, when the smoke from that small chimney appeared in the morning. She was not proud of this awareness, but she was honest about it. She crossed the street and knocked on the livery door at just past 8. He opened it looking as though he had not expected a knock, which she supposed he hadn't. He was in his shirt sleeves with a book in his hand. She caught the spine of it, a weathered copy of Thoreau, and his expression went through 3 things very quickly: surprise, then something warmer that he controlled, then the careful distance. "Miss Finley," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she said. "The dinner is on. People are asking after you." "I don't think I know what you think," she said. "I have heard what you think. You think you are not worth the trouble." She looked at him steadily. "I would like you to know that I will be the judge of that." The silence lasted long enough that she could hear the wind in the cottonwood by the water trough. "That is not," he started. "It is exactly what you say," she said, not unkindly. "Bess Totham told me and 2 other people confirmed it. You tell everyone who extends an invitation that you are not worth the trouble." She tilted her head. "I find that to be an extraordinary piece of presumption, actually. You are deciding for other people what is and is not worth their time." He looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening behind his eyes, some kind of reckoning, she thought, some internal argument that she was not privy to. "I have not been good company," he said finally, "in some time." "Nobody is asking you to be good company," she said. "They are asking you to eat food with them." "It is a very low bar, Mr. Ashford." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one, and it transformed his face briefly into something that made her understand, very suddenly and with a slight catch in her breathing, how handsome he actually was beneath the caution. "You are persistent," he said. "I prefer the word determined," she said. He looked down at the book in his hand, then set it on the barrel beside the door. He picked up his coat from the hook on the wall and shrugged it on. He looked back at her. "The low bar, then," he said. She smiled. "The very lowest." They walked across the street together in the cold November air, and the way the lamplight from the churchyard fell across the frost on the ground made it look like the whole town had been scattered with stars. He was not, as it turned out, bad company at all. He was quiet, but the kind of quiet that you understand is not emptiness. He listened to people when they spoke to him, and he answered in ways that showed he had actually heard them. He ate without self-consciousness, complimented Mrs. Calloway on the pork with a specificity that made her beam, and when young Henry Mercer, who was about 15 and trying very hard to look older, asked about horses, Andrew answered him with a patience and detail that left the boy bright-eyed and talking faster. Lavinia watched all of this from across the table while conducting her own conversation with Reverend Dawes about whether the church roof would survive the winter. She watched, and she thought that she had been right. He was not worth the trouble. He was someone who had convinced himself to stop occupying space in the world beyond the absolute minimum required, and it was a decision made from grief, and it had gone on long enough. After the dinner, when people were gathering plates and bidding good nights, Andrew found himself beside Lavinia at the table where she was wrapping the remaining biscuits in cloth. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For the biscuits," she said. "For coming to knock on that door." She looked at him. The lamplight was kind to both of them, and she was aware of it, and she thought he was aware of it too. "You should not have needed knocking on," she said, but gently. "No," he agreed. "I should not have." She tied the last parcel of biscuits and straightened up and looked at him directly. "Will you come to the next one?" "When is the next one?" "Christmas. Reverend Dawes does it every year." A pause. "Yes," he said. "I will come to the next one." Lavinia walked home across the frost-starred street feeling something she had not felt in a good while, something like the first warmth of spring, specific and full of promise. December in Caldwell was all cold skies and frozen mud, and the smell of wood smoke hanging over the town like a shawl. Lavinia kept the mercantile stove burning from before dawn and served hot coffee to anyone who came in out of the cold looking as though they needed it, which was most people by late afternoon. Business was good. The winter drives were done, and the cowboys who had earned their wages on the autumn cattle runs were spending freely, and the farm families who came in from the surrounding country for supplies before the roads became impassable filled the store on Saturdays and Fridays both. She and Andrew fell into a pattern that neither of them named but both of them honored. He came in each morning for his supplies and they talked for 10 minutes, sometimes 15. She learned that he was from Kentucky originally, the son of a horse farmer, that he had gone north to Nebraska at 20 with his wife, Clara, whom he had loved completely and lost to cholera along with their daughter when the baby was only 8 months old. He told her this in pieces, small and careful, the way you give someone something fragile, a bit at a time, watching to see if they know how to hold it. She always held it carefully. She told him about herself in exchange, which felt fair. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, about her father's ironmongery business, and how she had kept the books for him from the age of 12, about her mother who had read to her every evening until the consumption took her. She told him about coming to Wichita as a young woman to live with her uncle after her father died, about the 3 years she had spent learning the mercantile trade from a man who had been cranky and exacting and deeply fond of her in the way that people are fond who do not have an easy vocabulary for fondness. "He left you the store," Andrew said one morning as she was wrapping flour sacks. "He did," she said. "Did you want it?" She considered the question honestly, because he asked it honestly. "I wanted to matter somewhere," she said. "I wanted to build something. The store was an answer to both of those things at once, so yes, I wanted it." He was quiet for a moment. "You have made it something already," he said. "People talk about what the mercantile was before and what it is now. They mean it as a compliment." She looked at him. "Do you shop in your share of mercantiles, Mr. Ashford, that you have comparative standards?" The thing happened at his mouth again. That almost smile that was becoming familiar to her, and that she had begun to look forward to with a specificity that she recognized, was no longer simply friendly interest. "I have been in enough towns," he said, picking up his flour and his coffee tin. "Yours is the best." He went out and the bell above the door rang after him, and Lavinia stood in the middle of her store with flour dust in the air, and the stove crackling and her heart doing something it had not done in quite some time. The snowfall came in the second week of December, a proper plain snowfall that buried Caldwell to the axles of the supply wagons and kept everyone close to their fires. Lavinia dug out her front steps and boardwalk herself every morning, which became a subject of commentary among the town's more opinionated women, who felt that she ought to hire that task out. "Nonsense," said Lavinia, and kept digging. Andrew appeared on the third morning with a second shovel and began helping without being asked. She looked at him. He shrugged slightly. They shoveled together in the cold, bright morning without speaking much, and when they finished he came inside for coffee and they stood by the stove with their hands wrapped around their cups and watched the snow come down on Main Street, and it was the most companionable thing Lavinia had felt in years. "You did not need to do that," she said. "No," he agreed, "but thank you." "Yes," he looked out at the street. "You were going to do it anyway. Obviously. I know." He looked at her briefly with those cottonwood-colored eyes. "I wanted to." There was something in the way he said it that was very simple and very true and sat between them in the warm air of the mercantile like something that needed to be acknowledged but neither of them quite knew how to acknowledge yet. She looked out at the snow. He looked out at the snow. The stove ticked and settled. After he left that morning, Lavinia allowed herself to think, clearly and without evasion, about what was happening. She was falling in love with Andrew Ashford. She had perhaps started the moment he refused to look at her when she arrived in Caldwell, and she found that maddening and interesting in equal measure. She had been falling steadily since, the way you fall into a good river, gradually and then completely, and the water was cold but clarifying, and she was not afraid. The question was what he felt, and whether he would allow himself to feel it, and whether his grief was something he would carry forever as a reason not to be fully present in his own life. She thought about it. She was a practical woman. She came to a practical conclusion. She would not push. She would be present. She would let the thing develop at whatever pace it needed to, and she would not manufacture drama or urgency where none was required. She would simply continue to be exactly who she was, and she would trust that to be enough. And then the situation with the Hargrove brothers intervened, and she did not need to manufacture anything at all. The Hargrove brothers, Clem and Dale, were not from Caldwell. They had ridden in on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of December. Two big, rough-mannered men with the look of people who were accustomed to taking what they wanted from smaller places. They had gone first to the tavern and then to the general store next door and then, apparently, to the livery. Lavinia heard about the trouble at the livery from Henry Mercer, who came running in out of breath on Thursday morning to tell her that those two men from out of town had tried to take one of the horses that a passing cowboy had left in Andrew's care, claiming it was their own, and that Andrew had not let them have it, and that Dale Hargrove had taken a swing at him, and that Andrew had put Dale flat on the floor of the livery in under 10 seconds, at which point both brothers had departed threatening to return. "He all right?" Lavinia asked, already untying her apron. "Got a cut on his cheekbone is all," said Henry. She crossed the street to the livery with purpose. Andrew was in one of the stalls tending to the disputed horse, a gray gelding, when she pushed the door open. He looked up. He had indeed a cut along his left cheekbone, split cleanly, the kind a ring makes. "Henry told me," she said, walking to the stall. She did not ask permission. She had already pulled the small medicine tin from her apron pocket. She kept one there as a matter of habit, having grown up watching her mother do the same. She opened the tin and looked at the cut. "It is nothing," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down anyway." He sat on the stall rail. She cleaned the cut with carbolic from the tin and a clean cloth from her apron, and he held perfectly still, and she was aware of how close she was standing and of the warmth of him, and of the particular quality of attention he was paying to some point over her shoulder with great deliberateness, because he was also aware. "The gray belongs to a man named Cutter who came through 2 weeks ago," Andrew said, keeping his voice even. "He is due back for it. The horse is in my care, and it does not belong to the Hargroves." "I believe you," she said. "They may come back. Then you will put the other one on the floor too," she said, and pressed a clean cloth to the cut. "Hold that." His hand came up to hold the cloth, and his fingers brushed hers, and neither of them said anything about it, but neither of them moved away immediately either, and for a moment they were both very still in the smell of clean hay and horses and cold December air. "You should not be involved in this," he said quietly. He was looking at her now and not at the point over her shoulder. "I am already involved," she said. "I am your neighbor, and this is my town as much as it is yours. Lavinia." It was the first time he had used her name without the miss before it, and it altered the air between them in a way that was immediate and unmistakable. He looked as though he had not quite meant to say it that way. These are the kinds of men who do not distinguish between people. "I know what kind of men they are," she said. "I grew up in St. Louis. There are plenty of men like that in St. Louis." She looked at him steadily. "I am not worried about myself, and I am not worried about you, and if they come back, we will deal with it together." He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze, which she had found was always the right thing to do with Andrew, meeting him fully, not looking away. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met," he said. "Thank you," she said. Something broke open in his expression, not dramatically, not in any way that anyone watching from a distance would have been able to identify clearly, but she was close enough to see it. Something that had been held shut for a very long time came slightly, fractionally open, like the first crack in river ice in March. The Hargrove brothers did return on Friday afternoon, and this time they had a third man with them. A thin, wiry fellow with a low hat who stood to the side in a way that suggested he was present specifically to suggest harm. Caldwell's sheriff, a tired man named Gilmore who was 6 months from retirement and mostly honest, was out to the North Farms and not due back until Saturday. This left the town in the position of being responsible for itself, which frontier towns often were. Lavinia had been watching for them. She was at the window of the mercantile when they rode in, and she went immediately to find Andrew, who was already standing in the livery doorway watching them approach. Behind him she could hear the gray gelding moving. "Stay inside," he said without looking at her. "No," she said and stood next to him. He looked at her. She looked back. He seemed to accept this with the resignation of a man learning something about the nature of certain women. There were several things that happened in the next half hour that combined to resolve the situation. William Mercer, Henry's father, who had been listening from his fence, and had the kind of broad, steady presence that large ranchers develop after years of handling disputes, came to stand on the other side of Andrew. Jake Calloway, who had spent 15 years driving cattle before settling in Caldwell, and was not a man who was easily intimidated, appeared from down the street. Even Reverend Dawes came out onto the church steps, which did not constitute physical threat, but was a form of communal witnessing that even the worst men sometimes found uncomfortable. Clem Hargrove was louder than he was brave, it turned out. Faced with Andrew's unmoving calm, William Mercer's size, and the clear awareness of the whole town watching, his performance of menace wore thin quickly. The third man, the thin, wiry one, seemed to read the room and eased his horse back a step. "The horse belongs to a man named Cutter," Andrew said, for the second and final time. "When he comes back for it, it will be here. If you have a dispute with that, you can bring it to Sheriff Gilmore when he returns tomorrow, and he can sort it out lawfully. That is all I have to say to you." Clem Hargrove said several things after that, none of which are worth repeating. Then he left. His brother and the thin man went with him. They did not come back. When it was over, when the Mercers and Jake Calloway had clapped Andrew on the shoulder and returned to their respective afternoon businesses, Lavinia stood in front of the livery with her arms crossed and felt the particular quiet that follows something that almost became much worse. Andrew came and stood beside her. They both looked at the empty street. "You didn't stay inside," he said. "No," she confirmed. "I noticed. I thought you might." He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was going gold over the snow, the long, flat, gorgeous gold of a prairie December, and it lay across everything in the street and turned the frost in the ruts to something nearly beautiful. "Lavinia," he said, again without the miss, and then he stopped. She waited. She had learned that you waited with Andrew, that the words came when he had them right and not before. "I have been," he started, then stopped again. A muscle moved in his jaw. "I told Reverend Dawes when I first came here that I was not worth anyone's trouble. I have believed that. I have said it to everyone who tried to." He exhaled. The air was cold enough that his breath made a small cloud. "I want you to know that I understand what you said. When you said it was not for me to decide. I have been thinking about that since you said it." "And," she said. He turned and looked at her, and the gold light was full on his face, and she could see everything in it, the grief that was still there and always would be in some form, and below it, or maybe alongside it, something alive and careful and new. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said, "at the hotel, if you would allow it." Lavinia felt something warm move through her from her chest to the tips of her cold fingers. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "I would allow it." "Saturday," he said, "if you are free Saturday evening." "I am free Saturday evening." He nodded. His mouth did the almost smile thing, but this time it went further. It became a real smile, slow and quiet and so genuine that it caught in her throat a little. She thought that she had not seen him actually smile before, not like that, and that it was something she intended to see again and often. "Saturday then," he said. "Saturday," she agreed. They had dinner at the Henderson Hotel on Saturday evening, at a table by the window where the candles made warm doubles of themselves in the cold glass, and outside the snow lay soft and unmarked on the street, and the sky was enormous and dark and full of stars. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about horses and Kansas and Kentucky and St. Louis and books. He had read more than she expected. She had read more than he expected. They had both read Thoreau and had different opinions about it, and the disagreement was lively and equal and full of the kind of laughter that comes easily when two people have found each other. Mrs. Henderson brought them pie at 9 o'clock with the expression of a woman who was deeply pleased with herself for having suggested to Reverend Dawes 2 weeks ago that perhaps someone ought to invite Mr. Ashford to the community dinner. When Andrew walked Lavinia back to the mercantile afterward, the cold was deep and clean, and the stars were out in their winter fullness above the dark Kansas plain. At the door of the mercantile, he stopped and turned to her, and she turned to him, and there was a moment of absolute stillness that had all the weight of every moment between them since she had first called across the street to the lean, quiet man with the pocket knife. "I have not felt like this he said, and stopped. He looked at her with a kind of open, unguarded directness that she understood he did not give easily or often. "A long time," he finished. "I have not felt like this in a long time." "I know," she said. And then, because she was Lavinia Finley and she had ridden 3 days in a stagecoach to build something for herself in a new place, and she was not in the habit of not saying what she meant, "Neither have I." He reached up and touched her face with one hand, the calloused, careful hand of a man who works with horses, gentle as anything. And she turned her face into it slightly, and he looked at her for one more moment, making sure of something, and then he kissed her. Soft and certain and cold and warm all at once, and the stars above Caldwell, Kansas, in the deep December dark of 1878 bore witness. They stepped back and looked at each other, and the air between them had changed permanently and completely, and there was no going back, which was what they both wanted. "Good night, Lavinia," he said. "Good night, Andrew," she said. She went inside. She sat on the stool behind the counter in the dark mercantile, and she pressed her fingers to her mouth, and she smiled until her face ached. Christmas came to Caldwell with the communal dinner that Reverend Dawes organized as promised, and Andrew came without being asked. He arrived at the churchyard at the same time Lavinia did, which was not arranged but not entirely accidental either, and they sat together at the table, and their shoulders touched and nobody said anything about it, but everyone noticed and several people were very pleased. Reverend Dawes, passing behind them with a plate of cornbread, leaned down and said quietly near Lavinia's ear, "I am very glad you knocked on that door, Miss Finley." "So am I, Reverend," she said. "So am I, Reverend," Andrew said also, which he had apparently heard, and Lavinia laughed, and Reverend Dawes went away satisfied. The winter deepened and the new year came. 1879 arrived with a hard freeze and 3 days of blizzard that kept all of Caldwell indoors. Lavinia kept the stove burning and finished 3 books and wrote long letters to 2 friends in St. Louis describing Kansas and not describing Andrew, at least not directly. She described him in the particular indirect way that women in love describe things they are not yet ready to name in correspondence: a neighbor who was helpful, a man who knew horses, someone she had found to be excellent conversation. One of her friends wrote back and said, "You are describing a man you are in love with, and I hope you know that." Lavinia read this letter standing at her counter on a Wednesday morning and said aloud to the empty mercantile, "I do know that, Martha, thank you." Andrew came in at his usual time, and she was still smiling, and he noticed immediately because he had become very attentive to the details of her expressions, and he said, "What has made you smile like that?" "A letter from a friend," she said. "She says I write about you." He was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on the counter. "What do you write?" "Favorable things," she said. He looked at her with those clear, serious eyes and the ghost of the smile. "I write to my brother in Kentucky," he said. "He has asked twice now who the woman is." "What do you tell him?" "The truth," he said. that I have met someone that she is impossible to argue with, that she knocked on my door in November and told me I was not worth my own assessment of myself. Lavinia set down the tin she had been shelving and looked at him fully. That is quite a lot to write to a brother. I had a lot to say, he said simply. They looked at each other across the counter of the mercantile in the January cold, and Lavinia thought that she had never in her life felt so clearly and precisely seen by another person, and that it was both the most exposed and the safest she had ever felt, which she supposed was what love was, properly understood. He came around the counter that morning. He did not often do that. The counter was a line and he had respected it, but he came around it now, and he took both her hands in his and held them and looked at her and said, with the directness that was his truest quality, "I want to court you properly. I want everyone to know. He paused, and something vulnerable crossed his face that she suspected very few people ever saw. I want to not miss this because I am afraid." Lavinia looked up at him. She squeezed his hands. "Then don't miss it," she said. "I don't intend to," he said. He kissed her there in the mercantile, in the cold January morning, with the stove going and the smell of coffee in the air, and the pale winter light coming through the window, and she kissed him back, and it was better than the first time by every measure. The courtship of Andrew Ashford and Lavinia Finley was conducted with the particular combination of public acknowledgement and private depth that both of them preferred. They walked together on Sunday mornings. He had supper at the mercantile 3 evenings a week. She came to watch him work with a difficult horse one afternoon, and sat on the fence with her chin in her hand for 2 hours, watching, and afterward they talked about patience and animals, and what it meant to convince a frightened creature that it was safe. And both of them understood they were also talking about something else. He started coming to church. This caused a brief sensation in Caldwell, and then settled into the ordinary texture of things, as all news eventually does in small towns. In February, he showed her the book he had been reading the night she knocked on his door, the Thoreau, and inside the front cover, written in a careful hand, was the name Clara Ashford. He showed it to her without ceremony, just handed it to her one evening and said, "She would have liked you," and Lavinia held the book carefully in both hands and understood what he was giving her, which was not just information but trust of the deepest kind, the permission to exist fully in a life that also contained grief. She held the book for a moment and then handed it back and said, "I am glad you told me that. I wanted you to have it," he said. "The knowing." She put her hand on his arm and he covered it with his, and they sat by the mercantile stove in the February dark, and neither of them spoke for a long time, which was one of the things she loved about him. The willingness to be quiet with her, the understanding that silence between two people who trust each other is not emptiness but presence. Spring came to Caldwell with the explosive suddenness of the Kansas plain, the brown earth turning green almost overnight, the cottonwoods putting out their pale new leaves, the creek running high with snowmelt. The cattle drives picked up and the town was busy again, the streets full of cowboys passing through, the livery doing good business. Lavinia kept the mercantile stocked and the books balanced and hired a second girl to help Bess on the busy days. And between the two of them, they had the store running so smoothly that Lavinia sometimes found herself standing in the doorway in the morning sun, just looking at what she had built with a feeling of clean satisfaction. On the first Saturday of April, which was warm enough that people had begun sitting outside again in the evenings, Andrew asked her to walk with him along the creek. She brought a wool shawl because the evenings were still cool, and they walked along the bank where the cottonwoods made long shadows on the water, and the first frogs were starting to call from the reeds. He had something in his coat pocket. She could tell because there is a way a person moves when they are carrying something they intend to give, a slight adjustment of posture and awareness. They had reached the big cottonwood at the bend where the creek curved east when he stopped and turned to her. He did not rehearse it. He was not a man who rehearsed. He spoke the way he always spoke, directly, from wherever it was actually coming from. "I love you," he said. "I love you and I want to marry you. And before you answer, I want you to know that I have thought about this very carefully and I am not." His voice was steady, but she could hear the depth in it, the realness of it, the cost of the openness. "I'm not asking because I am afraid or because I want something to fill a gap. I am asking because you are the most alive person I have ever met, and being near you makes me feel like the world is something worth being in, and I want to be in it with you." Lavinia stood in the April evening with the creek running beside them and the cottonwoods whispering above, and the frogs calling from the reeds and Andrew Ashford's eyes on her face, and she felt the full weight and gift of his words settle over her like something long awaited and finally arrived. "Yes," she said. The word was simple because it was the most true thing she had ever said. "Yes, Andrew, I want to marry you." He closed the distance between them and kissed her in the cottonwood evening, and she put her hands up to his face and felt the warmth of his jaw against her palms, and she thought that she had been right. Back in November, standing on that freezing street, he was absolutely worth it. Every bit of it, all of it. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, a modest thing, a gold band with a small garnet the color of good red earth. "It was my mother's," he said. "I carried it when I went north, and I thought I would never use it again, and I was wrong about that." She held out her left hand, and he put the ring on her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her. They stood together by the creek in the April dusk, and the world was very beautiful and very large and full of everything that could still happen. They were married in Caldwell on a Saturday in late May of 1879, in the churchyard that was green and blooming under a sky that was the impossible blue of Kansas spring. Reverend Dawes performed the ceremony with the barely contained joy of a man who felt personally responsible for the whole business, which everyone in attendance agreed he was, in some measure. Mrs. Henderson made a cake. Mrs. Calloway brought food enough for twice the number of guests, which was her habit and which nobody ever complained about. Lavinia wore a dress of cream-colored lawn that Bess had helped her make during 3 evenings in April, with small pearl buttons at the cuffs and a belt of sage-green ribbon. Andrew wore the suit his brother James had sent from Kentucky when the letter arrived. James had responded to Andrew's news with a letter so enthusiastic that Lavinia had read it twice and decided she was going to like James Ashford a great deal. When Reverend Dawes asked Andrew if he took this woman, Andrew looked at Lavinia with those clear, serious, cottonwood eyes and said, "I do," with a conviction that made 2 women on the back row quietly press their handkerchiefs to their eyes. When Reverend Dawes asked Lavinia if she took this man, she said, "I do," and squeezed Andrew's hands and smiled at him with her whole face. Henry Mercer, who was serving as something between a junior groomsman and a general enthusiast, started to applaud the moment Reverend Dawes said husband and wife, which made everyone else laugh and clap along, and transformed the solemn conclusion of the ceremony into something warmer and more fitting for the 2 people involved. They danced in the churchyard that evening, a fiddle player from the Mercer Ranch and a boy who could play guitar, and the dancing went on until the stars were fully out and the fireflies had begun their work in the tall grass beyond the fence. Lavinia danced with Andrew 3 times and with Reverend Dawes once and with old William Mercer once, who danced surprisingly well for a large man. Andrew danced with Lavinia and only with Lavinia, which people commented on with approval. They moved into the house on the north end of Main Street that had been empty since the autumn, a proper house with 3 rooms and a porch and a vegetable patch out back and a small barn. Andrew spent 2 weeks before the wedding making it right, new boards on the porch, the windows resealed, the vegetable patch turned over and ready for planting. Lavinia put curtains up and rugs down and installed her books on the shelves he had built along the kitchen wall and stood back and looked at it all on the evening of their wedding and thought, "Home. This is a home." The summer of 1879 was full and warm and busy in the way of lives being well lived. Lavinia ran the mercantile with increasing competence and growing reputation. By August, she had a standing order from 3 of the larger ranches to the east and was supplying goods to 2 other small settlements within riding distance. Andrew's livery was the busiest it had been since the previous owner had run it, and by July, he had hired a boy named Sam to help him. He had also begun buying and selling horses with a quiet shrewdness that was making him steady money and considerable respect from the cattlemen who came through. They were happy in the specific, grounded way of people who have known grief and come out the other side into something real, not giddy happiness. Not the happiness of people who expect everything to be easy, but the happiness of two people who have looked at each other honestly and found something durable and worth everything. They told each other things in the evenings on the porch, in the bed with the lamp turned low, over the kitchen table in the early mornings before Caldwell woke up. He told her things he had not told anyone. She told him things she had kept only to herself. They argued occasionally about the mercantile accounts when he thought she was overextending credit to a family who was struggling, about whether to accept a contract he thought was too large, about small things the way all married people argue about small things. But the arguments were honest, and they always came back to the same place, which was beside each other, because that was where they both had chosen to be. In September, Lavinia told him she was pregnant. He had been brushing the gray gelding. Cutter had never come back for it, and Andrew had eventually purchased it from him at a fair price, and it had become his horse, which nobody in Caldwell found surprising because it was clearly Andrew's horse, and he set the brush down and turned and looked at her with an expression that went through so many things so quickly that she watched all of it cross his face. Joy, fierce and immediate, and then something behind it that she recognized as fear, and she crossed the space between them and put both hands on his chest. "I know," she said quietly. "I know what you are afraid of." His hands came up and covered hers, and he held on. "Tell me how to not be afraid," he said. "You cannot not be afraid," she said. "You love people, and that makes you afraid of losing them. That is not something you stop. You just carry it alongside the love and keep going." He put his forehead against hers. She felt him breathe. After a long moment he said, "We are going to have a child." "We are," she said. His arms went around her, and he held her in the September afternoon in the barn with the smell of horses and hay and the sound of the town going about its business outside, and she felt him shake once, not crying but something like it, something released, and then steady. He pulled back and looked at her, and his eyes were wet, and he was not embarrassed about it, which she loved. "I am so glad you knocked on my door," he said. "I am so glad you opened it," she said. He kissed her, and the gray gelding pushed his nose against Andrew's shoulder with typical horse importunity, and they both laughed, and it broke whatever was heavy about the moment into something lighter, which was also what they needed. The town of Caldwell received the news of the Ashford baby with the warm collective interest of a small community that has followed a love story from its beginning and intends to follow it to its conclusion. Mrs. Calloway came to the mercantile with a pot of good bone broth and a set of knitted booties that she had apparently started knitting speculatively in February, which she admitted without embarrassment. Bess Totham cried a little, which was unexpected and touching. Reverend Dawes clasped his hands together and looked skyward with an expression of profound personal gratification. Henry Mercer, who was 16 now and considerably taller, announced that he would teach the baby to ride when the time came, which Andrew said he would hold him to. Lavinia worked at the mercantile until December, moving at whatever pace she needed to and running the business as efficiently as she always had, which she found settling. She was not a woman who did well with idleness, and the work kept her grounded. Andrew fussed in the particular way of men who have lost someone and are frightened of losing again, which she handled with patience and firmness in roughly equal measure. In January of 1880, in a Kansas winter that roared outside the windows of the house on Main Street, while the fire burned and Reverend Dawes waited on the porch in the cold, and Andrew held her hand through every moment of it without once being asked, Lavinia gave birth to a boy. He was healthy and loud and deeply unremarkable in every way that mattered, and the most remarkable thing either of them had ever seen. Andrew held him in the crook of his arm in the first hours after, sitting on the edge of the bed, and Lavinia watched her husband hold their son, and she thought that she had been right about everything. Not in a way that was proud or self-congratulatory, but in the simple way of knowing that the decisions you made were the right ones and that the life you chose was exactly what you thought it would be and more. "What shall we name him?" Andrew said without looking up from the baby. "James," she said, "after your brother." Andrew looked up at her. His face was open in a way she had only seen a few times, entirely without guard. "Yes," he said, "James." And so James Ashford came into the world in Caldwell, Kansas, in January of 1880, in a winter that eventually softened into the most beautiful spring the territory had seen in years. The kind of spring that makes you believe the prairie had been quietly storing up color and warmth for the precise moment when it was most needed. Andrew wrote to his brother James in Kentucky, a letter that went 3 pages and was the longest, Lavinia suspected, that he had written in years. His brother wrote back that he was coming west in the summer to meet his namesake, which he did, arriving in July with a wife named Lavinia and their own 2 children. And the Ashford house on Main Street became briefly and gloriously chaotic in the best possible way. James the elder was a larger, slightly louder version of Andrew, the same eyes, the same quality of honest attention, but with a more ready laugh and the comfortable ease of a man whose life had not tested him in the same ways. He and Lavinia liked each other immediately and completely. Lavinia and Lavinia discovered a mutual love of books within the first afternoon. The children played in the yard, and the horses were very confused about all of it. On the last evening of James and Alina's visit, the 4 of them sat on the porch of the Ashford house as the July dusk turned the plains gold and copper and violet, and Andrew and his brother were talking about Kentucky, about their father's horses, about things that had happened a long time ago, and Lavinia sat beside her husband and listened to him talk about his past with ease and warmth, and she thought, "He has come back. He came back to himself." She had not known when she rode into Caldwell on that October stagecoach that this was what she was coming toward, but she would not have changed a single moment of it. Andrew turned to her at some point in the evening as his brother was telling a story, and he took her hand without ceremony, the way people touch each other when it has become as natural as breathing, and she laced her fingers through his, and he turned back to his brother's story, and she sat in the last gold of the Kansas summer, and felt the weight of her son sleeping inside the house and the warmth of her husband's hand, and the long, good expanse of time stretched out before them. By the fall of 1880, the mercantile had expanded. Lavinia had taken on the adjoining property that had been a failing saddle shop, and converted it into an additional storage and display room, which allowed her to carry a broader range of goods, and had drawn more regular custom from the farms to the west and the south. She had also, over the course of the year, quietly extended credit to 3 families who were struggling after a poor season, and every one of them had paid her back by harvest, which was the outcome she had predicted and Andrew had doubted, and which she mentioned to him with the appropriate degree of satisfaction. "You were right," he said, with the directness that was his truest quality. "I usually am," she said. "About most things," he agreed. "About certain specific things involving credit risk, I have revised my position." She smiled at him across the kitchen table. Little James, who was 9 months old and had recently discovered that banging a wooden spoon against the table produced a satisfying noise, banged his spoon. Andrew looked at his son with an expression of pure, uncomplicated love that was one of Lavinia's favorite things in the world. He was not the man who had sat on the barrel with a pocket knife, telling people he was not worth their trouble. He was not that man any longer, or perhaps more accurately, he had always been more than that man, and had needed someone to be the judge of that, and she had been glad to serve. The livery was thriving. He had completed 2 successful horse trades with a buyer from Dodge City, and was developing a reputation as someone who could source and train quality horses for working ranchers throughout the county. He went to church on Sundays and occasionally to the communal dinners, and came to Reverend Dawes' reading circle in the winter because Lavinia went, and they had found, somewhat to their mutual amusement, that they both preferred the same sorts of evenings, a fire and a book and each other's company, and the occasional passionate disagreement about what was on the page. He did not say he was not worth the trouble any more. She had told him early in their marriage that she never wanted to hear him say that again, and he had looked at her seriously and said, "I will do my best," and he had kept to that. There were times when something reminded him of what he had lost, when the anniversary of Clara and the baby passed and he went quiet and she let him be quiet and stayed near, that she knew the old weight was still there in some form. She did not expect it to disappear entirely. She only expected him to carry it alongside her, which he did. In the spring of 1881, Lavinia discovered she was expecting again. She told Andrew on the porch on a warm April evening, while James sat in the yard, attempting to catch a butterfly with the single-minded intensity of a child for whom the world is still full of achievable miracles. Andrew looked at her and his face went through the same series of things as before: joy, fear, then a decision, which was always the same decision, which was to stay. "Hello again," he said to the world in general, which made her laugh. Their daughter arrived in November, with considerably less drama than her brother and considerably more vocal opinion about the whole business, arriving in the early morning while the first snowfall of the season came down outside the window in fat, soft flakes, and the sound of Caldwell waking up came in through the walls. They named her Clara because it was the right thing to do, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. Andrew held her with the particular care of a man who had held a baby before and lost her, and who had chosen to hold one again, and he looked at his daughter's face in the morning light, and Lavinia watched him and thought that love, properly understood, is not the absence of grief but the willingness to continue in spite of it and alongside it, and that this man understood that better than anyone she had ever known, and that she had chosen exactly right. The years that followed were the years of Caldwell growing, and of the Ashford family growing with it. Kansas cattle country was changing. The great drives were at their height through the early 1880s, and Caldwell became a significant shipping point, the town filling out with new buildings and new businesses and new people. Lavinia expanded the mercantile twice and eventually took on a manager so that she could spend more of her time on the business side, the ordering, the accounts, the relationships with suppliers, which suited her better anyway. Andrew's horse operation became a genuine enterprise. He had 3 hands working for him by 1883, and a reputation that brought buyers from as far as Wichita and Dodge City. He had also, almost without intending to, become a person that people in Caldwell came to for advice, not because he sought any authority, but because people who are honest and direct and know how to be quiet tend to draw others to them, and he had always been all 3. Henry Mercer, who was 18 by the time Clara was a toddler, came to work for Andrew in the summer, as he had been trying to do since he was 15. Andrew took him on and found him to be exactly the kind of young man he had suspected: capable, curious, better with horses than most adults, and in need of the particular kind of mentorship that he gave, which was mostly leading by example and trusting the person to be competent until they proved otherwise. Little James, by the time he was 3, was already showing every sign of being his mother's child, a focused, observant, talkative creature who seemed to regard the store as his personal domain, and could often be found standing behind the counter watching Bess or Lavinia work with an expression of great seriousness. Clara, 2 years his junior, was her father's daughter in temperament, watchful, quiet, with sudden unexpected smiles, and a gift for animals that manifested at about 18 months when she sat perfectly still in the barn for 40 minutes, while a barn cat that trusted nobody allowed her to stroke its head. Andrew found this out when he went looking for her and discovered the scene, and he came back to the house and told Lavinia, and his face was full of a wonder that was also underneath, something like healing. "She sat still for 40 minutes, he said. "She gets that from you," Lavinia said. "The cat has scratched me twice this year," he said. "She gets the other part from me," Lavinia said. He laughed. She loved his laugh. It had taken time to come. It had taken the better part of a year to arrive fully, but it was worth the wait. It was the laugh of a man who had come back to himself and found more than he expected. In 1884, a letter came from Kentucky. James the Elder had decided to bring his family west. He had been watching Andrew's success with horses, and had capital to invest, and Eleanor had been corresponding with Lavinia long enough to know that she wanted to live somewhere near her friend. They arrived that October, a mirror image of the Ashfords' arrival 6 years earlier, but in the other direction, coming towards something instead of moving away. And the town of Caldwell, which had grown accustomed to surprising developments where the Ashfords were concerned, received them with the warmth of a community that knows a good thing when it comes. James and Andrew started a horse ranch together to the east of town, on 40 acres that Andrew had been quietly acquiring for 2 years. Eleanor opened a school. Caldwell's existing school had been run inconsistently and badly, and Eleanor had been a teacher in Kentucky, and approached the subject with a combination of genuine passion and practical organization that transformed attendance within the first month. And Lavinia, who had come to Caldwell with a trunk and a determination and nothing else except herself, stood at the door of the mercantile on a bright October morning in 1884, watching the wagons of her extended family roll down Main Street, and thought about the woman she had been when she arrived 24 years old, alone, capable, stubborn, looking down the street and thinking, "This place needs work." She had been right about that. It had needed work, and she had done it not alone but alongside a man who had told the world he was not worth the effort and whom she had looked at and said, "I will be the judge of that." She had judged. She had been right. She was almost always right. The mercantile bell rang behind her and she turned, and Andrew was standing there with James on his hip and Clara at his knee, and a cup of coffee held out toward her in the way he had of appearing at exactly the right moment, as though he had a sense for when she needed him, which she supposed by this point he did. She took the coffee. She looked at her family filling the doorway of the store she had built in the town she had chosen. "The wagons are in," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw. This is going to be noisy for a while," she said. "Probably," he said. "Are you ready for it?" He looked at her over their son's head with those clear eyes that she knew better than her own by now, and he said, with the simple directness that was his truest nature and that she would never stop loving, "I am ready for all of it." Clara tugged at his coat and he looked down at her, and she pointed imperiously toward the approaching wagons, because she was 3 years old and she wanted to see her cousins. And he laughed and set James down and took Clara's hand, and looked back at Lavinia with an expression that contained everything. The grief that was still somewhere in him like old weather, and the whole vast warm life they had built on the other side of it. She took his arm and they walked out into the October morning together, into the noise and the color and the wagon wheels and the horses and the voices of people arriving, and the town going about its ordinary miraculous business. And the Kansas sky was enormous and blue above them, and the cottonwoods along the creek were gold, and the air smelled of wood smoke and hay and possibility. And this was it. This was exactly it. The life that had been waiting on the other side of a November door in 1878, when a woman with green eyes had walked across a frozen street and told a grieving man that his worth was not his to determine alone. She had been the judge of that. She had been right. Years later, when people asked how it had started, and people did ask, because Caldwell had a long memory and an affection for the story, Lavinia would say that it started with a man on a barrel with a pocket knife who couldn't be bothered to look up when she arrived. And Andrew, if he was there, which he usually was, would add quietly that it started with a knock on a livery door in November, and that it was the best thing that had ever been knocked. James the younger, growing up, would tell his own children someday about his parents the way children of remarkable people tell those stories, with pride and fondness, and the slight exaggeration of love. He would say that his mother had ridden into Caldwell on a stagecoach and decided to fix everything about it, including his father, and that his father had needed it badly and been very grateful. He would say that they had argued about books and horse prices and credit accounts, and whether to build the porch extension on the east side or the west side, and that they had always come back to the same place, which was beside each other. He would say that they had built something real in that town, something that lasted: the store and the ranch, and the school his Aunt Alina ran, and the family that grew up with the sound of horses, and the smell of dried goods, and the Kansas wind in the cottonwoods, and the particular quality of love that comes from choosing someone fully and being chosen fully in return. Clara would say, when she was old enough to say it, that she grew up knowing what love was supposed to look like because she saw it every day, not the performance of love but the practice of it, the thousand small daily acts of attention and care and honesty that constituted her parents' life together. She would say that her mother was the most capable person she had ever known, and her father was the most honest, and that together they were something greater than either, which she supposed was the point. And on a Sunday evening in the autumn of 1885, 7 years after Lavinia Finley had stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, with a trunk and a determination, the Ashford house on Main Street was full. The elder James and Alina and their children, Reverend Dawes with his clasped hands and his careful joy, Bess who had stayed on at the mercantile and become indispensable, Henry Mercer who was 22 and doing excellent work with the horses and was showing signs of being in love with Bess, which everyone had noticed and nobody had yet mentioned to either party. They had gathered for no particular occasion except that it was Sunday and the autumn was beautiful, and Mrs. Calloway had made a pie and left it on the porch that morning with a note that said simply, "For the Ashfords," which Lavinia had found profoundly touching. Supper was loud and long and full of the overlapping conversations of a family that has enough history to sustain an evening of talking. The children were put to bed eventually, small Clara trailing up the stairs holding her father's hand, James already asleep on his uncle's shoulder. The adults stayed around the table with their coffee and their lamps burning low, and the talk became quieter and easier, the way talk does when you are with people you love and trust. At some point Reverend Dawes said, with the air of a man who has been wanting to say something for some time, "I have been thinking about that first community dinner, November of 1878, the one where Miss Finley came to retrieve Mr. Ashford." "You mean," said the elder James, "where she came to tell him he didn't get to decide his own worth." "That is essentially what happened, yes," said Lavinia mildly. Andrew looked at her across the table. There was something in the look that was only for her, the kind of private language that long-married couples develop without noticing, and she looked back, and the conversation at the table continued around them. But for a moment it was just the two of them in the lamplight, 7 years and 2 children, and a life built together in the prairie wind. And he looked at her the way he always looked at her, which was as though she was the most specific and irreplaceable person in any room she entered. And she supposed that she would never entirely get used to that, which was the right way for it to be. She was right, Andrew said, to the table in general but to her in particular. For the record, she was completely right. "I usually am," said Lavinia. "You are," he agreed, "about most things." "About the important things," she said. "About the important things," he confirmed, and reached across the table and took her hand. And the lamp light was warm, and the Kansas autumn pressed against the windows, and James Ashford the elder said something funny that made everyone laugh. And the sound of it went up and out into the night, into the prairie dark, into the endless western sky above Caldwell, Kansas. where a woman had once ridden into town and decided that a quiet man's assessment of his own worth was not a conclusion she was willing to accept. She had been the judge of that. She would always be glad she was.